What day is it?
It's my birthday.
It's good to share. But check you have the right privacy settings. Or someone can make a lot of money from being you.
This is a global original podcast. Margaret Atwood. Margaret, thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
My pleasure.
And it is, of course, as I'm sure you've heard a million times, rather hard to know where to start. So we'll begin at the very beginning, if we may, and then work our way towards the paperback publication of the Testaments this week. And as I read a little about your childhood, it occurred to me that no child ever knows that their own childhood is in any way extraordinary or different. But a word I heard a lot, or a phrase I heard a lot, read a lot, was that you didn't have a very socialized childhood. Presumably you weren't aware of that yourself at the time.
Not very socialized. What a polite way of putting it. Yes, I sometimes say to myself I wasn't properly socialized, which means that I probably charge in where angels fear to tread. And if I'd been properly socialized, I probably wouldn't do that. So I did grow up 3/4 of every year in the woods when I was a small child, but we'll just make it even more precise. So I was born in 1939. What does that tell you, James? It tells you that I was just frightfully upset. Actually, I was really pissed today to see that story about Donald Trump disparaging the military. Because Canada, as you know, was heavily involved both in World War I and World War II and suffered disproportionate losses. So my childhood was World War II until it ended. So that would be 45, 46, when I would be 5, 6. And wartime kind of continued on. I mean, it didn't feel like not wartime until about probably 49 or 50, because we were still having rationing, we were still doing all of those sorts of things. And when I did go to school, which was in the winter, we were very lined up and marched here and there, and into the girls' door and into the boys' door, which was a feature of schools at that time. And you just didn't know what awful thing would happen to you if you went in the wrong door. The wrong door, what will happen?
It's in the architecture of schools.
Yeah, it was those schools. And I'm sorry to say that the one I went to got knocked down and replaced with a modern one, but they did have those very sort of turn of the century Art Nouveau girls and boys over the doors.
So when you say that you sort of didn't develop any fear of rushing in, you mean that you weren't
well, no, I didn't know these social codes that were expected of people in that particular culture. I've always been interested in the experiences of aliens coming to Earth. I don't know why, James. In the E.T. movie, I identified with E.T. What can I tell you? So like that. But I did have an older brother,
right?
An older brother who was very keen on explosions. So we did play with dolls, but what we played with dolls was lining them up and sending them into battle and throwing them over cliffs. So not much Dolly's Tea Party going on in our very small child world.
And I mean, the doors aside, there's no sense at all of you having been on rails with regard to gender. Is that right? You wouldn't.
Okay, so up in the Canadian bush, James, you do not wear a skirt unless it's a very long skirt. And that is because of the mosquitoes and black flies, which would get up your short frilly skirt, and that would be the end of you. So I did wear quite a lot of my brother's overalls that were too small for him. I did have dresses. I had, I think, two in the city, but couture clothing was not a big. It was not a big subject of discussion in our household. So my mom was I guess you would say she was a tomboy. She much preferred it in the woods to being in cities, because in cities she had to wear hats and gloves, and that was not her thing at all.
Well,
So I was socially deprived of pink frilly dresses, which of course gave me quite a lot of interest in them later on.
when did you first encounter disapproval or suspicion of your I don't know quite what the word is, your disconnection from
Of me being a girl.
well, yeah,
I don't think it
girl,
was
not just being a girl, but more
in
not
general.
not fitting in
Probably when I was about 9.
right.
Yeah, about like that. So our family was somewhat strange. And also, since we weren't from the part of the country that we were living in, we had accents from a different part of the country. But these are not sort of major disabilities. And what was the result? I'm afraid it did not turn me into a socialized being. It made me turned me into somebody who didn't give too much of a shit, James.
Well, thank
Eventually.
God for that. Thank God for that. But I mean, as you got older, you must have felt a little bit more, if not pressure, then consciousness of
what... I kind of didn't. I don't know. I'm sure it was there. In fact, one of my school chums in teenage years, apparently she was forbidden to play with me because I was not a religious person. So, there are those kinds of things, but I didn't really pay a great deal of attention to them, it seems. And I think part of that is if you aren't growing up in a community where everybody knows everybody else, if you do grow up in such a community, you're very aware of social group disapproval. So if you read, for instance, the stories of Alice Munro, who grew up in a small town, everybody was very aware of everyone else's social status and who was below the tracks, who was highfalutin, who was la-di-da, who drank. All of the people know your business. And my mom came from a very small community, and that's what she said about it. Everybody knows your business. But if you don't grow up in a community like that and nobody knows your business except possibly chipmunks, you don't, you're just not as aware of it. It's there. And I'm lucky I wasn't living in the 17th century. I'm sure I would have been at the big bonfire. But as it was, I think it gave me possibly more freedom than other people felt. And somebody I went to school with said, "You just announced during lunchtime that you were going to be a writer." I thought that was so brave. And I thought, what was brave about it? I did not experience it as brave because I wasn't aware of all the taboos that might be out there against it.
So the distorting lens of sententiousness and judgment was one that you never looked through, really.
Well, I knew it was there, and I certainly became aware of it later on, but I didn't internalize it very much, James.
Yes.
So I think there might have been, there are things you were expected to do and things you were not expected to do, and every generation in every part of the world and every culture has those. But I wasn't, how shall I put this? I wasn't very susceptible to those kinds of pressures.
Neither were you consciously rebelling against anything.
No,
listening to
no.
Plowing your own furrow. It was.
Yeah, I think I was just eccentric, James. And people who are just eccentric are not necessarily rebelling. It is what it is.
But that's the difference, perhaps, is that there's something almost performative about rebellion, whereas what you describe is simply living the only life you could have lived, I think.
Yeah, I probably could have lived some other kind of life. I don't know. Oh, yes. So, how can I put it? It was what it was.
And what would the word belonging have meant to you as a younger woman? What a sense of belonging, or what you belonged to, or any
Okay,
sense?
what age of a younger person?
Well, I don't mind really. I mean, did you ever feel that you belonged? Were you one of those people who arrived at college and felt that you'd finally found your people, or were you always?
Nope.
Are you still? Are you still in a position where you? I mean, do you ever do you belong, and do you feel that you belong anyway?
I'm not. Oh, sure. The world.
Sure, but you know what I mean.
What's my little group?
Mm,
What's my little coterie? I kind of don't have one. I have, lots of friends and that kind of thing, but I don't consider it an us versus them situation unless somebody makes it into an us versus them.
yes.
So what, to go back to World War II, what was the idea? So I guess the big question was, where do you want to live? What sort of country do you want to live in? And I'm still asking that question.
Yes.
And it was pretty clear in the 40s that you didn't want to live with people who behaved like that, and you did want to live with people who behaved like this. So those kinds of distinctions, sure. Did I belong to my family, my extended family? Certainly, but most of them were about 2,000 miles away. So a lot of letters went back and forth in those days. People wrote, remember letters? You did this writing, you put a stamp on it, you put it in the post office. So my mom wrote her sisters every week, and they wrote her. And these were sort of family newsletters. So I suppose culturally you would say Nova Scotia, but I didn't grow up in Nova Scotia. So trying to situate me, we could go on a long time about this, and describing, I say, okay, I'm short. So I belong to the group of people who are short, short person. And that can be kind of determinate. There's a lot of things I was never going to be. So I was never going to be a champion pole vaulter or a basketball star.
No.
Yes, I weep tears.
Clearly,
yeah.
a great loss to both athletes.
I kind of mind that I'm not going to be an opera singer, but never mind. Other people do that very well.
Never say never. The sort of sense I get is, I'm interested in when literature arrived in this.
Very, 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 very early.
Yes.
So up in the woods, no television, no electricity, no running water, no radio, except we could get Russia on short wave. This is in the age of primitive man, before there was technology. So now everything's different. I can even get a cell phone signal up there, but at the time, we were living a fairly basic existence. So wood stove, kerosene lamps. So what did you do when it rained? You couldn't go to the movies. You couldn't watch TV. Nobody was watching TV in the 40s anyway yet, much. Or radio or any of those things, but there were lots of books. So my parents didn't, as they say, have a bean, but I've got my mom's account books, and I can see what they spent money on. It's pretty fascinating. And they did spend money on books. And the books were of all kinds. And they might be scientific books, they might be murder mysteries, they might be novels, they might be children's books. We were given children's books quite a bit. So you could do that. And there were comic books. So reading, I did that early, faute de mieux. Nobody would read me the comics. I had to learn to read. And writing, my brother was a prolific writer. He was 3 years older, and he wrote stories from an early age. So imitating, of course, I did too, but mine, I have to say, were not nearly as good. His were extremely detailed and illustrated. So we did do a colored pencil exchange in which I traded my red, yellow, and black and orange for explosions and smoke, for his pink, silver, and gold for princesses.
There's a warmth when you talk of your childhood. There was clearly a lot of love, even if there wasn't a lot of company around. There was a lot of love in your nuclear unit.
Yeah, we did have visits sometimes from other biologists, and some
Your
of them
father was
had
an
children. So
entomologist.
we're not. He was, yeah, he was a forest entomologist. And what was he doing up in the woods? He was studying infestations. And why was he doing that in the 40s, particularly? Because it was part of the war effort. So the forest products were a big part of making money to send basically to you, James. And we also had to make our at school in about 19, let me see, what year are we in? 47, 48. We had to bring our used clothes to school and make them into packages and send them to England. So we did all of that, and so we're back to Up in the Woods and other children. Yes, I didn't have an abusive, deprived childhood, although we didn't have a lot of, quote, stuff.
Sure.
So we didn't have things, but being who he was and with the background he had, because my dad was from extremely backwoods, rural Nova Scotia. So he had all of the skills that you would need. Everybody in that culture built their own house with help from the neighbors, but you built your own house, and he would build our furniture. So if you wanted a table, he would make a table. If you wanted some chairs, he'd make some chairs. And if you wanted a box to put your toys in, he would make a box. I still have that box.
Wow.
We had separate boxes. And the rule was that nobody could take something out of the other person's box without permission.
Would it be?
So my brother, being a conniving individual, he used to pretend. He said, let's play babies. I'll be the baby. And then he would ask as a baby for something in my box that he wanted to play with. And since I was very accommodating, I would give it to him.
Is it too obvious to suggest that, I'm sure it probably is, that you took your father's approach to insects and then later in life applied it to the human condition yourself?
In what way, James?
Just in
squashed like a bug? What are you implying?
You used the word infestation.
I mean, examine them carefully.
Correct, yes.
Oh, infestation.
Exactly that.
What part of insect life are we hearing? What kind of insects?
Well, it's the studying that leads to the understanding, isn't it? And the the understanding of what leads to totalitarianism, or what leads to the
yes, understanding. Yes, of course, but I think observation. And this was an age. It was before we had precise micro cameras, and if you were an entomologist, you needed to draw. So you drew with your eye on the microscope, looking, and then you were drawing what you were seeing. And so drawing was also a big part of the
right.
family life. And as a student, and it does actually work. If you draw something, you really know it, because you've had to really look at it. So life drawing of all sorts of things, it's always been pretty interesting to me. And at one point, I didn't want to be a writer at all. I wanted to be a painter.
Oh, really?
Yes, and I still take quite an interest in my jacket covers. I used to draw comic strip, and I also drew a series called book tour comics, which I distributed to my publishers to make them feel guilty. And you can see some of those on my website if it interests you, margaretatwood.ca. You can go to the drawings. So in my high school and college years, my projects were not always writing projects. Some of them were drawing projects. I had a silkscreen poster business that I ran off the ping pong table. You can spread things out, right?
Of course you can, yeah. When then did the ambition to be a writer crystallize, Margaret?
Well, again, I didn't know anything about it.
Oh.
This really was in the 50s. It wasn't a thing that you could be. Nobody spoke of being a writer. So we were given something called the guidance textbook. It was gray, James. It had all the jobs in it that you might wish to have. And there were quite a lot of jobs for male people, such as engineer and doctor and what have you. And there were 5 jobs for female people, and they were secretary, school teacher, nurse, airline stewardess, oddly enough. It's kind of sort of early for that, but it was there. They were called stewardesses in those days, and home economist. So I didn't actually want to be any of those things, but being a mercenary child and having had my first bank account at the age of 8, I looked at what they made. And this is where I made a major life mistake, because instead of taking secretarial sciences and learning to touch type as I should have done, I took home economics. So you want a buttonhole? I'm your gal, but I still can't touch type. So obviously in 1952, I was not thinking of being a writer at all. Then in 1956, I had actually a very good English teacher, and let's say hooray for very good English teachers. And I started writing poetry, not particularly because of her, but she did make the immortal remark of one of my poems. I can't understand this at all, dear, so it must be good.
Was it good, do you think, looking back?
No, it wasn't good. it was pretty awful, but it was very encouraging for her to say that.
Of course. And that, I mean, there's no sense, I don't think, in your work of seeking approval. So you were writing when you did start.
Well, I of course, everyone seeks approval. Everyone wants approval.
Yes.
So wanting approval and seeking approval are probably 2 different things. And the best advice about that really comes from John Bunyan, whom I've quoted quite a bit. It's his address to his own book, second part of Pilgrim's Progress, and he does the author's address to the book, which people did in those days. Go, little book, out into the world, etc., etc. And the book talks back, and it says, "I don't want to." And he says, "Why not?" And the book says, "Because what if they don't like me?" So author's deepest fear, what if they don't like me? And John Bunyan gives some very bracing advice, which I recommend. He said, some people don't like fish, some people don't like fowl, some people don't like cheese, and some people won't like you. So suck it up. It's true. Some people will not like you. If everybody likes you, there's something really strange going on. Because people are very, very individual, and they have their likes and dislikes, and those likes and dislikes may be very different from the likes and dislikes of other people. So some people won't like you. Deal with it. And John Bunyan says, in that case, go on until you find somebody who does like you, because that's your reader. And I offer this for anybody who's afraid to publish because they think somebody won't like them.
Tell me about the first little book that you sent out into the world, and whether or not you had Bunyan's words echoing in your ears as you did so?
No, I didn't have his words echoing in my ears because I hadn't read them yet. I came across them later. And where were these words when I needed them? Well, again, as I say, I've been somewhat impervious to considerations like that. So my first book was hand set by me. You have to set the type backwards, and printed on a flatbed press. So this is before the age of computers, and it's even before the age of, it's just as we were getting something called cold type. So computer graphics and all that stuff was far, far into the future. So we hand set, I had somebody working with me, we hand set the poems backwards. We had a shortage of A's, so we had to print each poem, and then we had to disassemble and set the next one. And I made the cover out of a lino block. Do you know what that is? So we used to make our Christmas cards that way. You have a lino block, and you've got these little tools that you gouge out pieces of the linoleum. The linoleum is glued onto a block of wood, and you gouge out the pieces where you want the ink to not go. So the part that you don't gouge is where you lay the ink down. And then if you're making them by hand, you put a piece of paper on top of that, and you use a spoon, back of a spoon, and you go like this to make the ink stick onto the paper. But we were able to put the lino block right into the press and roll the covers off that way. And then I made a production error. I should have hand sewn the pages into the cover, but I used something that I think doesn't exist anymore. It was called rubber cement. And its drawback is that when it's been dried out for quite a lot of time, it fails to work. So the early copies of this book, you have to be a bit careful because the pages will fall out.
You talk more about the craft of creating it than the content.
Yes, rightly so.
So you're prouder of the former than the latter? Is that fair?
Well, I was, 20, 21.
Yes.
I don't think I wrote anything of much value until I was about 25 or 26. But of course, you have to think it's of value.
Well, so how do you know the difference then?
Because I'm older. I've developed discernment and judgment.
Or more discernment and judgment.
More, yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So these were technically accomplished, and I won a prize, hooray. But I wouldn't particularly stand by them now. They're what we call juvenilia.
Yes. And
juvenilia is really interesting to me to read because it's encouraging. Most people's juvenilia is quite awful, but it shows, technical promise. Usually has something. But then a lot of people have something, but then they give up, or it's not the thing they choose. There were a lot of people at college who were much better writers than me, I have to say, but they didn't go on with it.
So why did you?
Stupidity, James.
Apart from the stupidity.
And I think I was really quite ignorant of pitfalls. And if it's that thing, if you look over the edge, then you'll get scared. So I guess I just wasn't looking over the edge. I wasn't aware of when we studied, it was the age of new criticism. So you didn't study writers' lives, you studied the work. You learned how to really analyze the structure, the imagery, and all of that kind of thing. But you didn't say this person was a dope addict and they shot themselves when they were 35. We didn't learn any of that. So we didn't learn anything about writers' lives, which for a while didn't interest me at all. But now they do. Now I'm quite fascinated by them. I guess when I was 21, I hadn't had much of a life, so I thought, what does it matter about the writer's life? I didn't.
Oh, I see. Yes.
Yeah.
And the juvenilia then becomes a useful window into the
Well, for other people. I mean,
Yes.
I suppose if I were really worried about stuff, I would burn it.
When did you begin to, or when did you realize that you could make a living as a writer? Because
Not for a long time.
Right.
No. This was Canada. It was the 50s and early 60s, and there was a community of writers that you could discover. It was pretty underground, but it was the age of coffee houses.
Yes.
So coffee houses, usually a group of young people who get some condemned building, and with exposed brick and sort of put some tables in there with checkered tablecloths and a microphone and then you would have jazz evenings. You would have folk singing evenings. It was the age of folk singing. And you'd have poetry night, and people would be asked to read, but some of them would just turn up and read. This idea of open mic is pretty old. And that was going on around 1960, 61. So I did that. And that's how you met other poets. So I did meet them at that time, and some of them from other countries would come through and read at such a place. So I started doing that. Then I was publishing in little magazines, and of which I think there are about 5. And but you didn't make any money out of it, and nobody expected to. And in that decade in Canada, it was very hard to publish novels because you needed an audience. People thought there wasn't one in Canada. And in order to make it financially viable, the publishers needed a co-partner. So somebody in the States, somebody in England, but we were too Canadian for them.
I see.
This was the age in which people would say, "Oh, Canadian writer, isn't that an oxymoron?" Ho ho ho. And they said the same thing of francophone writers from Quebec and Paris. So we were sort of Hicktown, and people would tell you that they would say, "You really want to be a writer? Get out of Dodge. Go to the States, go to England, go to France, because nobody takes that seriously here." Which was pretty much true. There was a small group of people who did, but it was small. So you did not expect to sell more than 200 copies of a book of poetry. And that would be going some if you even did that.
Wow. So you'd probably know everyone who bought it personally.
You would certainly know of them. Remember, Canada's really big. So some people lived in British Columbia, like 3,000 or 4,000 miles away, and it was before people were hopping onto planes. It's before book tours. It's before any of that. So no writers in residence, no literary festivals, no book tours. Those started a bit later in the 60s in Canada because Canada was so big. A guy called Jack McClellan started them. But poets would get on the Greyhound bus and turn up on your doorstep. And at that point, you were supposed to let them sleep on the floor, which they then did. And I slept on other people's floors. So there was a certain amount of exchange of that kind going on, but the infrastructure that people have now become accustomed to did not exist.
Just wasn't
and there were also not a lot of grants. There weren't all of these prizes that we have seen. There were big ones, of course, but we didn't even think about those.
But it was at the end of the 60s that The Edible Woman came out.
It came out in 69, but I actually wrote it in 64 5.
Okay.
And for
so right in the middle of this period, then it was written.
It was written. So the setting of it would have been about 63. It was completed in 65. It was actually accepted by a publisher, but then they forgot about it. And since I didn't have an agent, nobody had an agent in Canada. And I didn't know anything about publishing. I just thought it normally took that long. I really didn't know.
You didn't want to make a fuss. You didn't want to
Well,
ring them
no,
up.
it wasn't that. I just honestly, it's ignorance. It wasn't modesty or not wanting to make a fuss. I've got nothing against making fusses. I just didn't think, I didn't think it was required.
But if I'd met you then and I'd said, "Why do you write?" What would you have said?
And when I was 25,
in that period there, from completing.
oh, I would have had some very, very exalted,
Would you?
very exalted reasons, because we didn't have any detective story writers, trash writers, beach book writers. So everybody who was writing was very serious about it. We had exalted ideas of what we were doing, and I still have those somewhere in the back of my head. But you were not doing it for money. Everybody knew that. You had to have a day job, and your day job was either going to be in a business, which I did,
Yes.
or it was going to be in a university, which I also did. So support your writing by doing something else.
Of course. And when did your writing become?
When did I manage to make enough beans so that I could not have a job?
Yes.
Except piecework.
Yeah.
Piecework.
Exactly
yeah, I did a lot of piecework in the 70s.
Sure.
I would say 1973.
Okay.
But like that. But we're not talking oodles of boodle.
No.
We are talking enough to get by on. And at that time, we were living on a farm because it was cheaper. So big vegetable garden. I knew how to do that because of my vegetable gardening childhood.
Right. And your home economics as well.
Well, no, they didn't teach how to grow anything.
Right.
And
but you
home economics it didn't even teach you how to cook, James.
Okay.
I'll just set it for you. It was frowned upon to put your finger in what you were cooking. But you can't cook without doing that, James.
Well, I know that much. We need to jump fast forward now to 85 when The Handmaid's Tale came out. That was like,
that's a really fast forward. A lot had happened in this.
I'm glancing at the clock. I knew this would happen, and then of course there's another big leap to the Testaments.
Yeah.
I'm going to apologize in advance for this question because it's a bit rude, and you've probably answered it before. How much of a role did the success of the television series play in the decision to go back to the characters and to write the Testament?
Oh,
or was it there?
When I started writing it, that hadn't happened yet.
Right, good. That's
so I started before I'd even seen any of the television series, but during the time I was starting it, I was in a scene.
Yes.
Yeah, so we were shooting that scene in which I bonk Elizabeth Moss over the head.
Yes.
So
it was 20. I mean, more than 20 years later, but it was something you still felt.
Okay, so 85, out comes The Handmaid's Tale in the middle of a pushback. It was the 80s pushback against stuff that had happened in the 60s and 70s. So 60s was civil rights, 70s was second wave women's movement, women's rights things. And 80s was pushback against it.
Right.
So I'm writing it in 84, 5. I started collecting for it in 81, I find, by looking back. And then I kind of avoided it. I thought this is too nutty. And I was writing another novel which didn't work out. So the message was clear: you have to write this one, or you're not going to be able to write anything. So I did that, and there were different reactions to it in different parts of the world. So England said, "Jolly good yarn," because they'd already had their religious civil war. They didn't want to have another one. So whatever kind of totalitarianism they were going to have would have been quite different. Wouldn't have had the outfits and the god and all of that. Canada, they said nervously, as they always say, could it happen here? Yes, Canada always frames itself in those terms. What about us? Nervous they are. And in the States, they said two things. Oh, fiddlesticks. It would never happen here. And on the other hand, how long have we got? So two quite different reactions. And that tells you something.
It does.
So time moves on. There's a movie in 89.
Yes.
And I was there in West Berlin for the launch of that movie while the wall was coming down. And then we took it over into East Berlin, and the audience reaction was very different. So West Berlin, people were talking at the after party of the direction, the acting, the decor, and all of those things that people talk about. And in East Germany, they were like this.
Gosh.
And then afterwards, they said, this was our life.
Yes.
And what they meant was not the outfits or the theology. They meant you couldn't trust anybody. And we know now how true that was. How many informants the Stasi had in East Germany. So then we had the 90s, in which people said, end of history. Silly old them. and attention sort of veered away from those possibilities. Yes. Surely we were not going to have any more totalitarianisms. Wrong. Then comes 2000. Then comes 9/11. People start getting scared and realize that. Do you know that game called Pick Up Sticks, when you have a bunch of sticks and you try to move one without moving the others? Every time you move a piece on the world chessboard, other pieces move. So the other pieces had all moved when nobody was looking. And then we had the financial meltdown and people got even more scared. Then we had a sort of lull before the storm, which was the Obama years. And my theory is that those happened because the Democrats figured out social media before anybody else and politically in the States. But then everybody caught up with that, including Russia. Yeah. And here we are with a very polarized United States, a weakened United States, a frightened United States, and groups in the United States for whom The Handmaid's Tale is like a playbook. So that's why I was coming back to it. I could see that this story was not over. In fact, the story had changed much more towards The Handmaid's Tale than it was in the 90s. I couldn't write the story from the point of view of the main character in The Handmaid's Tale because it would just sound like an imitation of itself. Right. So I decided to view not the beginning of Gilead, but the crumbling of it, because I'm very interested in crumbling, having lived through a number of crumblings. It's interesting to me not only how these kinds of things get going, but also how they collapse. And some of them don't until the main actor dies. Franco kept going until there was no more Franco. Same thing with Salazar in Portugal. So same thing with Mao, really. And that's not over. It's just changed its mode of operation. Okay, so back to the Testament. So I was writing while they were filming.
Great.
And then I actually got to see the series like everybody else in 2017. And by that time we'd had the Trump election, and there was a sort of perfect storm, if you like, which meant that nobody looked at the TV show and thought, oh, silly old them, what a fantasy. They didn't think that. No. So then I was continuing on writing until early 19, by which time we'd had season 2. And of course, I'm in pretty close contact with Bruce Miller, who is the showrunner of the show. And the difficult part was to make sure there was no big contradiction between what they were doing and what I was doing, but we did manage that.
Indeed. I mean, some dystopian fiction is a warning. Yours is
it's
more
all a warning.
No, it is all well, then I will ask you this question then, which is, how do you retain your optimism and your faith in human nature when for want of a better phrase, when the failure of your warning is all around us?
Well, it hasn't failed yet, James.
No, but it's not. No, you're right. Of course, it hasn't failed yet, but it has gone probably further towards.
It's gone further in a more overt way than I ever would have thought possible.
Overt being the key word.
Overt, yes, yeah. Overt. I mean, the Ku Klux Klan has been around for a long time.
Sure.
But just not quite so obviously so. Yeah, it's gone further in a more overt way than I would have thought possible.
And when it's not warning, it's dissection. And I'm laboring this probably a bit, but I'm back to the entomology, the idea, not so much of the outsider, which is what typifies a lot of dystopian fiction, but the impossibility of actually being an insider. You say in East Germany, everyone was spying on everyone, so nobody actually was an insider. Nobody actually belonged. Everyone is corrupt in some sense by dint of their participation in the society, and that the Testaments goes in deep on that idea, I think.
Oh, well, yes, Gilead 16 years later has entered its corrupt phase.
Yes.
So at the beginning of these things, there usually are some true believers. Yes. You know, they really believe in them, in the program. And with USSR communism, there were a lot of true believers. Mm-hmm. So, and you'll notice that Stalin, when he did his purges, he killed all the old Bolsheviks. Yeah. Because they were still true believers. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you want to get rid of anybody. It's like the Grand Inquisitor scene. Dostoevsky, who said the Grand Inquisitor, Jesus, turns up and the Grand Inquisitor knows who he is, and he says, "Go away and don't ever come back." You know, you're really messing up my program here. So when you enter the corrupt phase, you don't want true believers.
Right.
So when you enter the corrupt phase of American politics, you don't want people who really believe in democracy, because they're not going to approve of what you're doing, are they? So like that. Yeah, so we are in the Testaments, we're in that phase. And when you enter that phase, there are quite frequently people on the inside who realize how corrupt everything has become and become double agents. So I read quite a few books about double agents.
Right.
Who decide this is wrong and I've got to bring it down. And those would be, you know, whistleblowers from within administrations who have done criminal things.
Yes, and that's, I mean, and we see it unfolding in front of us every day. I think we've managed to achieve a form of narrative arc during this conversation. I hope so. I could carry on talking to you forever, but...
good luck with that, James. Yeah, narrative arcs, we love them.
Type. But thank you so much, Margaret Atwood. It's been a privilege to talk to you.
James, lovely to talk to you. Thank you. Good luck to all of us. Hooray, hooray.
Hooray, hooray.
Keep the faith, James, whatever that may be.
Thank you, Margaret. I shall do my best.